Não lembro, Doris, mas vão fazer, né?
Claro, não.
Mas aí não precisa. Aí a gente não precisa traduzir, porque eles vão fazer em português, imagino, né?
Temos que fazer para ele, para o inglês.
Ah, tá.
Eu só quero coordenar com você. Teoricamente vai começar pontualmente às 6 horas, tá?
Tá.
Então, vamos fazer aquilo que combinamos de 15 em 15.
Tá.
Você quer...
Pronto. Então, o título do nosso diálogo dessa noite é Cuidando das Nossas Dores em Tempos Pandêmicos. Esse é um título que foi escolhido pelo próprio Lama, né? E a gente vai direto ao ponto. Então, a gente queria primeiro agradecer ao Lama por nos oferecer um tempo precioso da sua vida, da sua agenda pessoal, para conversar conosco, né? E oferecer os ensinamentos que são adequados para a gente lidar melhor com as nossas dores e as nossas desesperanças, né? Que estão se apresentando num tempo assim tão turbulento como esse, né? A gente queria agradecer também a Daniel, que é o secretário do Lama Rod, por ser tão empático e gentil. Ele nos ajudou diretamente na criação desse momento que para nós é surpreendente. Também gostaria de agradecer às nossas queridas intérpretes, Doris e Yara, né, que passaram horas assim treinando, ouvindo o próprio Lama, né, para, enfim, poderem oferecer a melhor interpretação. Também gostaria de agradecer, nós gostaríamos, né, do psicoterapiacontemplativa.org, nós gostaríamos de agradecer a todos vocês que estão aqui, que estão, enfim, abrilhantando, né, surpreendentemente estão, assim, trazendo esse brilho para o nosso momento. Esse é um momento que a gente esperou muito que acontecesse, né? E, por fim, eu gostaria de agradecer a Fernanda e a Tâmara, que são as minhas companheiras, né, dentro do projeto, e é maravilhoso poder seguir trabalhando com elas, né? E é isso aí. Então, eu vou fazer uma rápida apresentação do Lama Rod Owens, mas antes, eu acho que a Tâmara tem algum aviso relacionado à interpretação. Não sei se a Tâmara gostaria de alertar as pessoas.
Oi, boa noite, pessoal. Só vou dar uma pequena orientação para que corra tudo bem e vocês consigam acessar e escutar o Lama bem direitinho, tá certo? Então, vocês, para quem está no telefone, vai apertar na tela, certo? E aí vai aparecer 3 pontinhos do lado direito embaixo. Esses 3 pontinhos, onde tem embaixo mais, vocês vão apertar, certo? Aí vai aparecer a opção interpretação de idiomas. Aí lá vocês vão colocar onde tem um globo, vocês apertam e vocês vão selecionar a opção em português, para quem estiver aqui no Brasil, certo? E aí vocês podem colocar na parte de cima concluído. Aí vocês vão conseguir escutar o Lama com a tradução da Doris e da Yara, tá certo? O segundo ponto é que as perguntas vão ser enviadas para o chat e eu vou repassar as perguntas junto com a Fernanda para o Lama e aí vai ter uma pessoa lá selecionando. Então, a gente não sabe se ele vai conseguir responder todas as perguntas. Mas aí a gente vai estar repassando para ele e eles vão estar verificando quais vão ser as possíveis, tá certo? Aí vocês podem ir enviando para o chat e a gente vai repassar para eles, tá bom? Então, sejam todos bem-vindos, bem-vindas e vamos lá. Vale?
Então, obrigado, Tâmara. Então, vamos. O Lama Rod Owens é um ministro budista, um professor budista, autor, ativista, instrutor de yoga e lama autorizado na escola Kagyu do budismo tibetano e é considerado um dos líderes, um dos principais líderes de sua geração de professores budistas. Ele possui um grau de mestre em divindade em estudos budistas pela pela Harvard Divinity School e é coautor do livro Dharma Radical, conversando sobre raça, amor e liberação. Lama Rod é cofundador do Bhumisparsha, uma prática tântrica budista e também uma comunidade de estudo, que vale a pena conhecer. Lama Rod publica em revistas e sites importantes, como Buddha Dharma, Lions Rower, Tricycle e The Harvard Divinity Bulletin, e oferece palestras, retiros e workshops em mais de 7 países. Um livro para estes tempos é O Amor e Raiva, O Caminho da Liberação através da Raiva, foi publicado em junho de 2020, foi aclamado pela crítica por sua verdade profética, pela sua atualidade, honestidade e sabedoria. Então, muito obrigado, Lama Rod. Nós estamos passando a palavra para você e seguimos em frente. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much to this group for inviting me. This is my first teaching virtually in Brazil. Of course, I have yet to visit and teach in person, but this is the first time I've taught to a group in Brazil, so I'm very happy. For many years, since Radical Dharma, Brazilian people and different groups in Brazil have been asking me to teach, and so this is the first time I've been able to do this. So I'm very grateful to be here, offering whatever I can offer to support you in your practice and your work with others. I'm very grateful to everyone who made this possible, to the organizers and to the translators. Often when I'm teaching in other countries and with folks who are speaking different languages, I feel very ashamed. I feel ashamed because I don't know the language. I barely speak English well enough. And so I'm very grateful for translators who are able to support me to communicate to others in different languages. So thank you so much. And again, my name is Lama Rod. I live on the ancestral indigenous land of the Muskogee, Creek, and Cherokee people, the indigenous people of this area. Now we call this land Atlanta, Georgia, in the southern United States. And this is my ancestral land, the land of my indigenous ancestors, as well as the land that my African and enslaved ancestors lived and worked on as well. So I remember all the beings, all the communities and cultures associated with this land and who are still on this land. And I'm very grateful for the support and the love of the land and the earth in my life and in my teaching. And again, welcome to everyone who's joining us for our time together. Tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about grief and pain during this time of global pandemic. But I believe that a conversation about grief is always appropriate because we are human beings, and grief is a constant and very powerful part of our experience in the world. We are often experiencing the struggle to understand loss and death and change. Change, as we understand in Buddhism, is one of the laws. It's one of the qualities of living in life is change, constant change. Everything is always changing, always moving. Things are being created and born, and people and things are leaving or dying. We grow old. We start very young, then we grow older. We change ideas, we change our personalities, we move around. Our relationships are always changing. There are always different circumstances that we're having to make sense of. And all of this requires so much effort and so much labor and work to be in a relationship with. For me, grief is the practice of being with the inner reality of loss. So it is the ways in which I'm trying to take care and practice with sorrow and sadness that comes from loss and change. And then on the other hand, mourning is what I do outwardly. It's the work that it's the way that I express my grief outwardly. And this outward expression of grief means that it's about how I take care of myself. It's about the boundaries that I create to take care of myself. It's about how I communicate the grief to others around me. Then there are many other parts of mourning that are very cultural, that are a part of the cultures that we grew up in and the communities that we were raised in, that help us to continue to what I call metabolize grief, which means to practice with grief, to offer grief a lot of space to be in our experience. And for me, that is the basic practice of working with grief, is offering the grief just space to move through my experience, to begin to name and to recognize how grief is showing up for me, and to allow myself to experience the grief, not to push away, not to run away from, not to cover up, but to experience. And to experience means that we allow ourselves to get curious about what grief feels like. What does this feel like? What does the grief feel like in our minds as a mental, emotional experience? And what does grief feel like in our bodies as a physical or as physical sensations? To feel it, not to think about it, not to process it intellectually, but to feel it, to sit and to just to feel the energy of grief. And so when I experience grief, I'm allowing myself to just experience the energy of grief, right? And part of my practice and my experiencing is to describe what I'm feeling, to describe whatever it is that I feel arising in my body, to feel whatever I feel arising in my mind, to name it, to describe it, because to really experience the grief allows us to begin to experience a liberation through the grief, to experience freedom. I experience freedom when I allow myself to feel the grief and not to necessarily react to the grief. So sometimes when anything arises in our bodies and in our minds, often we react. And when we react, it keeps us from actually experiencing the grief. It actually keeps us from experiencing anything. And often when we react to anything that comes up for us, we actually, can potentially create more harm for ourselves and for others. And reactivity doesn't heal our grief or anything, our pain or trauma or anything. It doesn't heal, it just actually perpetuates. It keeps feeding the experience of suffering, over and over and over again. I think our experiences of grief and any kind of discomfort in our experience is asking us to care for it. So when I experience suffering, I know that that suffering wants to be cared for. It wants to be loved. So much of my practice is to love everything. Even the things that may seem unlovable. I believe that this practice of loving everything is a very, very difficult practice. It's a very advanced practice. So maybe you hear this and you say, well, that is impossible for me to do that, But in my practice early on, I committed myself to developing a love for everything, including the grief and all the trauma and the suffering that I experienced. That doesn't mean when I love everything, it doesn't mean that I like all this stuff. Like and love are two very different things. For me, love means that I accept the reality of something. And I have to accept the reality of something before I'm able to do something about the thing that I'm accepting. I talked about reactivity. So what we're trying to do is move from a place of reactivity to response. And the practice of loving everything helps us to develop the space to respond to things. And when we respond to something, then we can do the work of changing the thing that we're responding to. You can't change something that you're just reacting to. And reaction is what I call habitual. It feels instinctual. When I feel something, I instantly react without thinking. It seems as if it's just a programmed situation. It's a programmed thing that when I feel a certain thing, and I just instantly react to it. For instance, when I feel something hot, I instantly, take my hand away. That's a reaction. That reaction is meant to keep me safe. But not all reactions to suffering and pain keeps us safe. Some reactions actually continue to perpetuate discomfort and harm. Right? So in contemplative practice and our meditation practice, we are training ourselves to develop the space in order to respond. And in the responding, we can think about, we can, what I call discern how we should be in a relationship to whatever is arising. So when I go back, when I talk about love for me is the basic work of accepting something, not liking it, but accepting and saying that this is happening. There's trauma, there's pain, there's grief. In my experience, there's pain, trauma, and grief in the world around me. My love draws me into a deeper relationship to that discomfort. And the closer I get to this experience of discomfort, pain, or trauma, the more I begin to understand what the nature of this experience is. So sometimes we feel pain and we want to get very far away from it. So if this is our pain right here, we want to get very far away from it because it hurts, it's uncomfortable. But in our practice, in our meditation practice, we have to learn how to move closer to the pain to begin to see very clearly, to experience very clearly what this is. You know? And love is a way that I'm able to move closer to the pain, to experience the pain, the suffering, or the grief. Often I think about clouds to make sense of this. So something that I enjoy about being on an airplane and flying is how when I'm on an airplane, the airplane goes up and up and up into the clouds. And so from the ground looking up at the clouds, we think that the clouds look solid. You know, when I was very young, I used to imagine that the clouds were just like land floating up in the sky, and that there were beings living up in the clouds, that you could walk on the clouds and build houses, you know, and live on the clouds. Also, when I was little, maybe some of you may have heard of this cartoon. This was an American cartoon named The Care Bears. And the Care Bears were, it was a cartoon, and the Care Bears were these little bears. They were all different colors. And each Care Bear had a different symbol on their tummy, on their stomachs. And that symbol was kind of a power that they had. Lionheart, right? So these Care Bears all had different symbols, and then they would get together and they could get together and use their symbols, to fight off evil. But the Care Bears lived in the clouds. And so when I was little, I thought, oh, I want to be a Care Bear because I want to live in the clouds. You know, it seems so much fun. So of course, as I grew older, I realized that you can't live in the clouds. But, you know, of course, as you grow older, you learn about science and physics and biology, and you begin to understand the clouds are just water. You know, they're droplets of water that are suspended together in the air. So when I'm in an airplane, I love going up into the clouds, and the closer you get to the clouds, you know, you begin to see how luminous and spacious the clouds are. And then the airplane goes into the clouds, and out the window, you're able to see these little droplets of water that are suspended together to create the clouds. And I think that's really important because that is the nature of everything that we experience. From very far away, we look at grief and we say, oh, this is this really heavy, solid thing. But when we get closer, when we develop the practice of loving everything, we are allowing ourselves to get closer and closer to the clouds, or you get closer and closer to the pain, the grief. And you're able to see that grief is just all these different experiences coming together. All the experiences of stories, and the experiences of assumptions, and the experiences of fixations and attachments, experiences of fear, experiences of desire, all these different narratives and experiences coming together to create this one experience. And it's so important in our practice that we allow ourselves to be drawn closer to the experience of grief, so that we can begin to experience just the pieces of grief, not the whole experience of grief at once, but we begin to experience the different pieces of grief bit by bit. We also begin to discover that grief doesn't have to be about something that's happened right here in the present moment, that grief can be about our ancestors that have come before us. Grief can be something that I call transhistorical. That means it's pain, it's grief, and trauma that are passed from generation to generation. And then we kind of inherit that grief in our communities and in our families. So this is transhistorical grief, and there are many things that are transhistorical. Trauma is transhistorical, grief is transhistorical, anger, rage is transhistorical, depression can be transhistorical, right? Again, these are the larger things that our communities and our ancestors and generations before us experience, and then they just kind of pass it from generation to generation. And so much of our work right now in this moment is to, again, to practice with these energies, these emotions, these experiences that have been passed to us, from past generations. And not only do we have this kind of transhistorical experience, but we also have the collective experience of grief. So the collective experience, which is what is so strong for me right now, is this collective grief, which is the grief of everyone, not just the communities that we live in, the cities, the towns, or the communities that we're a part of, but it's just the global experience of grief, the global experience of loss right now, of change. And of course, the grief arises from actually not being able to really understand or to let go of everything that we've lost and everything that's changed, right? And so the grief is so much about hanging on to something that's past, to something that's gone, and doing the work of trying to come back into the moment, right? Coming back into what's actually happening right now. And of course, we also have the capacity, the ability to also pass all of these things on to our descendants, to those coming after us, to not just our children, but just to other young people who are coming up after us, who will be alive after we've passed on. And so part of my commitment and my practice is to disrupt, to break the ways in which I may pass on these experiences to people coming after me, maybe to the kids that I have. I don't have kids, but if I have children, to work very hard not to pass on these transhistorical experiences to my kids, or to any young people before me, or to not create the conditions for others to be born into that may actually create harm for them in the future. So to do whatever I can to do my practice of healing in this moment, so that those coming after me will not have to continue to do so much of the work that I was not able to do. In the same way that we've been having to do so much of the work and labor from past generations as well, right? And so looking at this really complex view of grief, we also know, on top of everything that I've talked about, transhistorical grief and this kind of what I call the composite complex view of grief, we also have to understand that grief is something that we're just, it's grief that's being created just moment to moment, right, every day. And I call this kind of like everyday grief, right? Just the ways in which there's always change, there's always loss happening. And that it becomes really easy to kind of lose a connection to everything that's changing, to everything that's being lost, you know. And so much of our contemplative practice, particularly in mindfulness, is about how do we develop an awareness of what's happening in this moment, in this second. You know, what does that look like? And how do we begin to notice and practice with and accept the change that's happening right here in the moment? You know? And this is why having just a daily basic practice of working with grief is extremely important. And it will be extremely important as we continue to move through this period. I think that, you know, particularly later this year, one of the things that will be really, really critical is really the grief, the grieving. You know, I think that in our different countries, many of us want to get back to normal and have a normal life again. But I think there's going to be great grief when we realize that there's no going back to something that we've lost. You know, there's no recreation of the time before a pandemic. And that the work that we're being presented is to choose to live and to be in different lives now, to embrace different ways of being, to embrace different ways of seeing, to embrace different ways of being in community with one another. And of course, we have to embrace the ways of really deepening individual work around grief, and also really stepping into practices of collective grieving. You know, collective grieving that will help us collectively move through this great, intense grief, loss, sorrow, sadness that has accumulated, you know, for many of our communities. You know, it's and for me in my personal practice, grief is something that for many years I've taken very seriously. It's been, I think grieving has been my primary practice in my personal practice. Because I'm grieving for myself and everything that's changed in my life over, you know, my years of being alive. I'm also doing the grief for everything that's happened to my ancestors as well. Everything my ancestors, my indigenous and African ancestors have lost You know, and my practice is, again, identifying, noticing, naming the grief that's coming up for me, knowing that my experiences of grief are very different than your experiences of grief. You know, there have been many models of grief. But the one thing that is true for any model of grief is that no one, that grief, our process of moving through grief, looks very different than another person's process of moving through grief. I just had an uncle who just passed, who just died very recently, last week, and it was a very difficult death. And I, you know, my family asked me to help organize the memorial service and to support, you know, people moving through the grief of my family. And my uncle and aunt had one son, a cousin, my cousin. And we were talking actually last night just about loss and grief. And he was just talking about how, you know, his experience of grief is so different than what he's read or understood in the past. And I told him that's very important to understand. And it's so important that we all understand that, like, our experience of grief sometimes doesn't line up with what we've read, you know, or studied, or what we've seen. And that it's important that we just develop a sensitivity to our unique movement through grief. So I wanted just to offer a very basic practice that I think can be really helpful in helping us to move through our grief art, to begin the work of working with grief. And this is, you know, a practice that I talk about in my latest book, Love and Rage, which I hope will be translated into Portuguese as soon as possible. So, but we are beginning to work. We're beginning to explore how to do that right now. So I just wanted to say that. But this practice comes out of the book, and of course, you know, this translation will be available, you know, now on video. So, which I'm very happy for as well. So this is the practice that I call SNOL, which is a very weird name. It's an acronym. And so of course, which means that every letter of this word SNOL is a practice instruction. So SNOL, so the S means to see. So S equals see. So we're just naming, you know, we're looking rather for what's arising for us in our bodies and in our minds. The second letter N, of course, is English N. This will be, of course, very different in Portuguese, so I apologize for that. Maybe we can find an equivalent translation somehow, which will sound hopefully better than the English SNOL. But anyway, the N stands for naming. So we see it and we name it. The O is owning. So owning really means that I just recognize that this is happening in my mind and in my body. So it helps me to draw my attention to my particular experience. The E means, of course, to experience, right? So we're experiencing, we're getting curious about what this feels like. So the experience is moving from the kind of thinking to just feeling. So we're not, so the experience isn't this analytical process, it's an experiential process. And I would say in contemplative practice, experiencing is the point. Like that experience is the 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 main practice of contemplative practice is to experience. What does this feel like? And so after we've experienced, for as long as we can, for as long as it feels appropriate, we move into letting go. This is also important because I don't want to fixate on experiencing all the time, but I just want to kind of let go of intense experiencing, right? And come back into whatever experience of space that I've been able to connect to. The space is really important. And again, the space comes from letting go of reacting to everything. And once we stop reacting to everything, we begin to understand that there's this incredible mental space that's always present. And then the last L is letting float, letting everything float, which is just a continuation of letting go. So when I let something float, I just keep reminding myself, okay, I'm just going to keep letting this go, keep letting it go, right? And just resting within this experience of space itself. Okay. So that's the snow, and I add another piece to that. So the practice that we'll go through, we'll just spend about 10 minutes with the practice. But in the practice, when we get to experiencing, we're going to experience it. And then before we let go of the experience, we're going to contemplate really the fact that there's so many other beings going through this as well. So it helps us to build empathy and compassion. When we say it's not just me that's experiencing this grief, but it's everyone, all beings who are experiencing this. And this helps us to feel less alone and less isolated. So I would like to just lead us in the practice. And we'll just practice for about 10 minutes, okay? So as we begin our practice, I just encourage you just to be as natural as possible, to allow your bodies to be in whatever position feels appropriate for you right now. And to continue, I invite you to shift your attention to noticing the weight of your body making contact with your seat. So allowing the sensation of your body on the seat to act as an anchor for your attention right now. And so we'll enter into the practice. And we begin with beginning to look into our minds. And we're going to be working with experiences of grief. Okay. So beginning to get curious, beginning to look for grief in the mind. What does that look like? And grief can be sadness, sorrow, it could be anger. It can feel like apathy. Grief can be an experience of numbness as well. And as you're looking, beginning to name these experiences of grief that you're seeing. Once you've named these experiences, I invite you to just begin to understand that these experiences, these things that we've named, are happening within our own bodies and minds. And now we move into experiencing. So I invite you to choose just one thing that you've been able to name in your experience with grief. To begin to experience that one thing, be it sadness or sorrow or anger or whatever it may be. And so letting go of thinking about, analyzing, intellectualizing, and just experiencing this thing in your mind, maybe as a physical sensation in your body. Not reacting, just allowing this experience to simply be. As we move deeper into this experience, I invite you to just reflect on all the many beings in the world who are experiencing this very same thing. Reflecting on how we're not alone in this experience, but this is an experience that's shared by many, many beings in this very moment. So we begin to transition into just letting go. So in our practice of letting go, just letting go of our practice of reflecting and experiencing, allowing our minds to just rest, letting go of its need to experience or empathize. As we let it go, we continue to let it float, continuing to letting go over and over again. Returning our attention to the seat, again, to the weight of our bodies making contact with the seat as a way to anchor our attention. So letting everything go, returning back to the seat, allowing the mind to be as spacious and open as possible. Okay. Transitioning out of our practice now and coming back into a space, slowly beginning to open our eyes if our eyes were closed. And just stretching, moving the body, doing some gentle movements to awaken the body. Okay. Thank you all so much for your practice. We're going to take a look at some questions that we have coming in. Okay. So we have about 3 questions here. So first question. So I help a person who for many years, 25 years, after the death of her father has blocked access to her own feelings. She doesn't react because she reports that she can no longer access feeling, neither the joys nor the sorrows. Thank you so much for this question. I think this is a very common situation for many people. So I think part of the intensity of grief for some of us is that we feel very powerless when we experience it, so we kind of push it away. And I think that grief is something that can be worked with in bits and pieces over time. I think part of the reason we don't feel we have the capacity to work with the grief because we don't feel as if we have enough support, enough resources. We don't trust enough. We don't trust that we will be taken care of as we move into the grief. Often in the past, I have felt with very old grief that somehow I will not survive the experience of grief itself because it's so overwhelming. Also, here is really important to mention the relationship between grief and trauma, because grief actually can lead to trauma, and grief can accompany trauma as well. So there are these kinds of relationships between trauma and grief that is important to understand. So what this person actually would benefit from is more work around more work around trauma. So somatic experiencing would be something that would be important for her, because I think this is something that is very related to her physical body as well. I think somatic experiencing is something that can actually help us to connect to these deeply repressed experiences of grief. And this also sounds like disassociation, as well. That actually intense grief can actually, can be a reason, an underlying cause of disassociation as well. So trauma, so work around trauma is, I think, how she will be able to get into grief, somatic experiencing. I think trauma-informed practices are really a way to go as well. Movement is really important here, physical movement. Something that I teach that I haven't mentioned in our session tonight is I teach a practice that I call the 7 homecomings, which is from Love and Rage as well, from the book. And in the practice, it's just a way for us to think about the kinds of supports that we can call into our practice that helps us to experience really difficult emotions like grief. I think that's really incredibly important. You just can't do grieving on our own. Like, I believe that we should ask for energetic help to do grief. And that comes from not just my Buddhist practice, but it comes from my shamanic practice as well, that we call in the support, the help that we need to do grief. as well. So that's what I would say about this for right now. The next question, what would it be like to collectively deal with grief? I think one of the things that has to happen is that we have to allow ourselves to grieve openly and publicly. That grief isn't something that we should push to the side, that, grief isn't something that should happen in our personal space at home or away from people. That when grief arises, we create the conditions for people to move through grief as it arises. We begin to create programs and practices that we're able to do together, collectively, in groups together. In our cultures and countries and communities, we begin to develop the language around grief. That this is something that's natural and that this is something that's happening with all of us. And for those of us who are practitioners, who are therapists, who are really working with folks in professional capacities, we are really being called on to model personally what grieving looks like publicly. So I try not to hide my grief, but I try to grieve openly and publicly, so I can show people what this looks like, and I can invite people to do their own grieving. It's also developing the capacity not to be afraid of people's grief. Of course, what that means is that first, I have to let go of being afraid of my own grief if I'm going to not be afraid of other people's grief. And a lot of us are afraid of grief. We run away from people who are grieving, right? In the same way we run away from our own grief. So the only way I'm able to support people in their grieving is by first developing a practice so that I can do my own grieving and hold space for that. Okay, next question. How can we turn this place of pain regarding ancestral experiences into a place of power and compassion, okay, regarding the groups that still perpetuate violence against minorities? I think one of the ways that we do this is first, and this is very difficult to do, but we have to do this work of understanding that the people who create harm for others are themselves in pain, right? So the people who have hurt me in my life, I understand now that they have been in a lot of pain, and so much pain that they've created harm for me. That is the work of empathy, of connecting to the experiences of others, particularly the emotional experiences of others, and understanding, that people do the things that they do because they're often experiencing something that is very difficult for them to practice with. So we talk about the violence of one group against another, that everyone is suffering in this situation. But as if we find ourselves members of communities that are being oppressed, who are experiencing violence, you know, that so much of our work is to reflect back to our oppressors the violence that they're doing to us. So in a way, we become mirrors. So if you choose to hurt me, my response is to not necessarily return violence back to you, but to mirror back what you're doing to me, because you may not actually understand what you're doing to me, and you don't understand it because you're committing the violence against me and those in my community. And there are so many methods that have been used by many groups to communities to do that. And just, you know, even deeper from my personal experience of being in several marginalized communities and groups that face violence, so much of my personal practice is to hang on to the compassion for myself and for others, you know. But the compassion means that the compassion helps me to understand what's happening. And the compassion also, particularly compassion for myself, also helps me to understand how to take care of myself, how to set boundaries, how to protect myself and those in my community. So compassion means that I am also figuring out how to disrupt the violence that I and members of my community are experiencing, and how to disrupt that by not perpetuating and adding hatred and violence to the world, but by trying to figure out how to disrupt the ways in which those committing the violence disrupt their experience of just being out of control. You know, when we're perpetuating violence, it means we're out of control, and how to disrupt that experience of someone or a community being out of control. I think how to do that is really left up to the community itself. You know, so I would also say that just from my experience, it's the compassion is also the love that helps me to understand what's happening in the violence against me and my community, but also to understand that I have a right to protect myself at the same time, and to figure out what that looks like in a way that doesn't create more harm that needs to happen. So when I protect myself, I'm not protecting myself or my community because I want the oppressor to hurt as much as I do. I'm protecting myself because I want the oppressor or whoever's committing the violence to understand, you know, the violence that they're committing. And that's it. You know, so I protect myself not to get back at people, to hurt people in the way they've hurt me. I protect myself in order to allow those who are attacking me to see what they're doing. You know, to see and to understand what they're doing. And that's where the power comes from, is that I choose not to return the same kind of violence that I am receiving. You know, that my practice calls me to actually practice this kind of love, but this love and compassion are, you know, this love and compassion doesn't mean I continue to let things happen to me. You know, it means that I love myself and my community enough to disrupt the violence that we're experiencing. Okay, I wanna make sure I get through as many questions as possible. This is an important question. I want to skip down. A collective pain today is related to facing the pandemic, especially in Brazil. Indignation, anger, aspiration for radical change. How to move this pain to transformation, pain to transform. How to calm people who feel the pain of losing hope. Yeah, hopelessness is a part of the grieving. I think one of the ways that many of us, one of the things that's happening for many of us across the world as I've been in communication with people in different countries is, how do we do the work of dreaming something different? So this hopelessness, you know, comes from this loss of something that we've been really, we've aligned ourselves with. It's our lives that are changing, right? So as my old life is dying, everything that I've loved, everything that I've been attached to, everything that's defined who I am, how do I let that go and then do this work of dreaming something different? What's the new life, a new way of being that I can now begin to invest in? You know? And as someone who's been hopeless often in life, I know that for me, hopelessness has been something that has triggered my imagination to begin to think of something different, a different way of being, and everything that I've known is ending, or being lost. So much of grief in this way is understanding that we've used other things around us to create a sense of self. And when these things are disrupted or change or they go away, our sense of self is disrupted, or the sense of who we think we are. So to come back to a more stable sense of self, what I've had to do in the past is just actually let go of who I thought I was and to begin to practice to move into a new way of being, right? So a way to do that, of course, we let our old selves die. And this hopelessness that we're experiencing collectively is really death. Like our old selves are dying. And not all of us are going to make it through this process, through this kind of dying, right? Not all of us have the capacity to let our old selves die and to let a new self be reborn. A new self that's more resilient, a new self that's much more in tune to impermanence, you know, and the changing nature of everything. That dying process, and I think this is different for different cultures, but in the culture that I, have been raised in, so much of this hopelessness and this dying is important, because the rebirth into something new, into a new life, into a new self is part of what we call resilience. It's like I have to let something die in order to give birth to something new, to something that's more in tune to the changing nature of the world and my community. We have to be willing to change. Being willing to change means being willing to experience this kind of psychological death, psychological, emotional death, in order to be reborn into something different. And just lastly, just say, I know that we're at time, but I believe that grief is just something that's something that we have to do every day, and we will do every day for the rest of our lives. And what we're trying to do is create a practice that helps us to do our everyday grief, that we have to grieve everything, but we can make that part of our practice, and that practice of grief can be held within the experiences of deep appreciation, deep love, deep compassion, deep joy, for everything else that's happening. For me, my grief practices daily. I have a formal grief practice that I go through daily, and anytime I feel grief arising, I'm doing the practice, and it's okay. Because I know that this is part of what it means to be human and in this body, and to be a part of the world and a part of communities, and to be in relationships. Things are always changing. Things are always dying. People are being born and people are dying. There's illness and sickness and disasters and climate instability and injustice. Everything is always happening. Now allow myself to experience the disappointment, the changingness of all of this. And it's okay. And the more I'm able to do this practice, the more I'm able to be in the world doing things to help people, instead of being kind of trapped by the overwhelming grief. Okay, so I would like to end here. I think it's time to end our time tonight, I believe. So thank you so much to everyone for your practice and for your time tonight. I hope this has been helpful, for as much as hopefully it's been helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Lama. Thank you for all these teachings and wisdom and love that you shared with us. And we are always, always very welcome in Brazilian Sangha. And I want to thank Yara too, Doris, for the translation, and Ale Tamara for our team of Psicoterapia Contemplativa. And we keep connected, right? And I hope that soon we have the translation of your book for Portuguese. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you for supporting each other path. And we see each other soon in the next dialogue. Okay. Thank you very much, Lama.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Lama.
Obrigada, Lama.
Obrigado, yes.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Lama.
Obrigado. Obrigado, Chico. Thank you. Obrigado.
Muito bom.
Obrigado, meu povo.
Obrigada.
Um abraço, muito obrigado.
Tchau, gente. Obrigada.
Valeu, Sanga Timão.
O pessoal que ajuda na divulgação, o pessoal do Escuta Compassiva, que
Todas
está
as
aqui.
pessoas. Um abraço nos amigos da escuta.
Escuta, Carmelina, o Sandro também ajudou na divulgação, que está aqui.
Sandro está aqui, o Sandrão, ó, legal.
A Carol,
Simone.
o pessoal do Dharma, do grupo do Henrique, que também está aqui.
Muito bacana.
Muito bom estar com vocês.
Obrigada.
Beijo no coração de todos.
Beijo, gente. Tchau, tchau.
Beijo, tchau. Obrigada.